Dean Carroll and Dr. Gold are going to present to us the topic of the separation of powers. What is it and why is it that we have a separation between the executive, the legislative, and judicial portions of our government? So we'll have small tables again, much opportunity for conversation about some very interesting questions, so I invite your attendance. Those programs run from 7 to 9 o'clock. We've added an extra half hour so that there's plenty of time for interaction. Following that, we have a wonderful program that's being presented by Dr. Martin Horney. You might not know his name unless you came on Tuesday night and I explained who he was. Dr. Horney is the professor emeritus from the University of Mount Union. He's also quite a musician, a choral musician and so on, involved in a lot of liturgical music. He's going to present a program on Henry Nouwen. Nouwen is a fascinating man who went through a number of different permutations of the question of what is my life about. He ended up his life working with the Walsh community in Canada, with people who were profoundly disabled, learned a lot about faith and a lot about life, was a prolific author. Dr. Horney's presentation is something that he's been working on now, I would say, close to 7 months. He's the first person who called me up and said, I've got to bring my people over to rehearse the presentation. He's got voices that are going to read portions of it. He's got a wonderful PowerPoint and a fascinating presentation. The thing that caught me when I watched his rehearsal is the portion of it in which Henry Nouwen learns about faith, the meaning of faith, by going to the circus. It was a wonderful little piece. You'll enjoy that. So that's going to be on March 27th. Our April programs are actually 3 in number. 2 of them have to do with preparation for Yom HaShoah, the Holocaust Memorial Day. The first one is going to be on April 5th and will be done by Dr. Brad Beach, who is professor of philosophy here at Walsh, but is also a member of the Genocide and Holocaust Education Board of the state of Ohio. He's going to present an evening program on the history of genocide in the 20th century. Not a happy topic, but something that is quite important for us to understand. He's also in charge of our Blue and Scholar program, which is a special dormitory on campus, has a cohort of special students who do special programs in addition to their academic studies. He took a group of those students last summer to Auschwitz, and these students are going to do a program. The date will be April 10th. They're going to do a program which shares with you their experience walking on sacred ground. It should be a pretty powerful program. And then finally, our final program of the year is on April 17th. Dr. Chris Seaman, no stranger to us, is teaching a course which links his students in theology and multiculturalism, his students here in Stark County, with students at the Oranim University in Israel. And they've been having back and forth, and they're doing a project together on multicultural dimensions of faith. So the culminating project for his students has been to identify different faith communities in the area, northeastern Ohio, to go and create documentary videos about them, interview the people, and present a program on the intersection of faith and diverse cultures. So their program is going to be a series of these videos. Hopefully we'll also get some videos from the students at Oranim. They speak English very well, but they're not confident yet. So it should be an interesting way to see not only what our students can do, but a point of view that we don't normally have. So if you want a brochure, I've got extra ones. We're doing pretty well in terms of the progress of our year. I helped a great deal, I must tell you, in presenting this evening's program, preparing this evening. I had a lot to do with it. When Dr. Torma who I dine with periodically for lunch, mentioned an idea about Pope Francis and said that he wanted to do it with Dr. Vincenzo. I said, Holy Joe's, that's my contribution. I'm going to make an additional contribution this evening. I'm going to sit right there with the clicker, and we are going to make non-verbal contact between myself and the speakers.
It's going to be very subtle.
Would you give us an example of that subtle contact? Did you see that?
So I got that when I was in
If he raises,
It can mean a lot.
if he raises the right eyebrow, I go forward. The left eyebrow, I go backwards. Both eyebrows, I throw up the clicker. I'm looking forward to this. There have been few people, especially to the non-Catholic world, who have captivated, I think, our attention by his coming onto the stage of leadership, by the image that he has. And this picture is what I always see. I always see him washing your feet. And so it is a great pleasure to invite Dr. Joseph Torma and Dr. Joseph Vincenzo to present the program this evening.
Thank you, Rabbi. Joe and I are more informally known as the Ashtabula boys because we actually come from Ashtabula. We went to the same grade school, although I was 8 years ahead of him. But we didn't really meet until he came here in 1987. And we've actually become quite close, and we have actually done work together. We did a couple of courses, symposium courses together. And we're thinking that this might be a preview of coming attractions. We're going to try to cram a lot of stuff into a very small period of time. And then we would hope to expand it into a course, an honors course, which we would like to give. So that may be in the future. Because as you're going to see, there's so much here, and we can only go like a stone skipping across the water. Boom, 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 boom. Because we not only have to cover, he's 80 years old, we got to cover periods of his life. We need to cover the two most major documents that he's done. One was his first papal exhortation on the joy of the gospel, and the other is on the environment, because the church had not had a formal document on the environment, which was clearly a missing link in its social teaching. So we're going to do that today, spend each of us 15 minutes of doing one of those. So what we're going to try to do is I'm going to introduce a little bit, and then Joe is going to talk about the early life. I'm going to talk about 5 minutes, and then he's going to talk about 10 minutes of the early life, and I'm going to talk about 10 minutes of his sort of Bishop Cardinal Pope life, and then I'm going to do 15 minutes on his papal exhortation, the joy of the gospel, and then he's going to do 15 minutes on Laudato Si, the environmental encyclical, and then I'll do 5 minutes of summary, or at least conclusion. That's our plan. How you can keep two professors down to an hour together, I don't know, but we'll try. If you want to yell and throw stuff at us, that's okay too. We have two completely different styles of presenting, and that's always a good thing. This is how I present. I walk around, ask people questions. Joe is going to stand there and be very academic and read his paper. So that'll give you a contrast. Okay. A few points I want to make. Some of these you already know. You certainly know the first two bullets. You know he's the first Jesuit Pope. You know that he's the first to use the name Francis, which really surprised me, because Francis is probably the most popular saint across the whole Christian world. Many saints are particular to particular denominations, but he's probably the saint most popular. So I was very surprised that he was the first one named Francis. And supposedly he's the first middle-class immigrant. We know that there are statistics and facts that say he is the most well-known and liked person in the world. Now, obviously, if you say 90% like him, the 10% that don't, that's still about 750 million people who don't like him. But by and large, he's the most liked person in the world. The main contribution, which I really want to talk about, because I think it's absolutely essential, he basically has moved the focus of Catholicism from what are called instrumental realities, law, orthodoxy, and ritual, to the center, the essential reality, compassion. And the word compassion simply means to suffer with. And you can't suffer with the poor if you're not with them. So he said, Jesus, who reveals compassion, okay, is the one that he wants you to focus on. And everything else is secondary. Important, yes. Law is important. Orthodoxy is important. Ritual is important. But none of those get you eternal life. We know that from Jesus. What gets you eternal life is compassion. And so he wanted to focus back on that, afraid that although everybody knows that, by focusing on law, orthodoxy, and ritual, they forgot that which was essential. And so what he's kind of focused us back on is what it means to be Christian. I gave a talk at Stark State, and I called it, I was the first Catholic theologian to give a talk there. And I was asked to talk about Christianity, because there were other people talk about Islam and Buddhism and things like that. So my talk was the best kept secret about Christianity is Christianity. Most people do not know that Christ is not Jesus' last name, it's his function. Sort of like saying Donald President. It's his function. And it simply means anointed, but meaning appointed. As he says in Luke 4:16-19, I've been appointed to care for the poor, the blind, in prison, the oppressed, and those suffering injustice. So anything else he would do, go to the temple, go to the synagogue, go in the desert, all of those kinds of things, were valid only to the extent that they enabled him to care for the poor, the blind, the oppressed, the imprisoned, and those suffering injustice. And that's, in fact, what I think the Pope has kind of pushed us back to see.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming on this great day. Jorge Mario Bergoglio was born on December 17, 1936, in a small rural town of Flores, a scenic region of Buenos Aires. To those who gave any credence to astrology, his birth sign is Sagittarius, the skillful archer and learned healer whose higher intelligence forms a bridge between heaven and earth. But even if one is skeptical of astrology, his birth sign does presage his later heroic defense of the poor and the disenfranchised, and his relentless efforts to build a bridge between heaven and earth. Jorge was the eldest of 5 children of Italian immigrants. Mario Jose Bergoglio, whose family left Italy in 1929 to escape the fascist rule of Benito Mussolini, and Regina Mara Sfori. As a boy, young Jorge grew up in a unique time in Argentinian history known as Peronismo, a cultural and political phenomenon named after the legendary president of Argentina, Juan Domingo Perón, and his wife, Eva. The political party of Peronism was called Justicalismo, an appellation indicated a period of justice in which the needs and conditions of millions of hardworking, poor immigrant families were accommodated. Having been reared in this period, the impressionable Jorge assimilated a profound sense of social justice and a deep compassion for the underprivileged and exploited, a sensibility and conviction that would follow him throughout his life. As young Jorge grew into adolescence and into a young man, he became a great admirer of the tango and the traditional music of Argentina and Uruguay known as milonga. His hometown, Flores, housed some of the most famous milonga musicians and tango dancers of the time, and young Jorge and his sweetheart, Amalia Del Monte, would frequent their performances. As time passed, he himself became an accomplished tango dancer. This fascination with the tango and the traditional music of Argentina was not a mere passing fancy for young Jorge, but reached deeply into his spirit. "I love tango and used to dance when I was young," he told Francesca Ambrogetti and Sergio Robin, the authors of his 2010 biography, Il Gesuito. And when asked about what most influenced him in his early life in a 2010 interview, Pope Francis responded, "Tango comes deep from within me." Given the deep influence this art form had on young Bergoglio, it is worth more careful consideration. Anyone who has had the pleasure of witnessing the tango performed by accomplished dancers cannot help but be deeply moved by the spectacle. The tango involves two human bodies coming together as one graceful work of animated art. Unlike other art forms in which the artist is one thing and the medium another, in dance, the artist's moving bodies become the very medium of art. In the dance, we witness not the separation of spirit and body, and the elevation of spirit above the body, as we find throughout Platonized Christianity. We behold rather the spiritualization of sensuality. The tango is a celebration of the joy of the physicality of spirit, of the incarnation of spirit. The tango, moreover, is a dance form unfolding between two persons. One cannot tango alone, and unlike other forms of bodily activities, such as competitive sports, tango dancers display a felicitous concordance and discordance. There it is. I should have done it earlier. I wish to argue that Pope Francis's later identification with the natural world, his deep compassion for the creatures of the earth, humans and non-humans alike, and his unique emphasis on felicitous cooperation were shaped by his early fascination, admiration, and performance of the tango. What the tango instilled in him was a recognition and admiration of the beauty of cooperating bodies, shining forth in felicitous concordance and discordance. It provided him with a direct perception of the beautiful and joyful unity of spirit and nature. And since it is a uniquely Latin phenomenon, it provided him with an appreciation of the wonderful diversity of cultural expressions. This recognition later grew, I wish to suggest, into an awareness and deep appreciation of the immanent physicality of divinity, of cooperative activities, and the importance of cultural diversity. As he matured, Jorge's admiration for art, especially Argentinian dance and music, it continued. But he also began to show a deep interest in academics, especially theology, philosophy, psychology, literature, and natural science. This interest led him to enroll as a student at the Catholic University of Buenos Aires, earning a master's degree in chemistry. Upon graduation, Jorge worked for a short time as a chemical technician at the Hichthier-Bachmann Laboratory. Throughout his life, he remained, among other things, a man of science. One evening after work, just before he was to meet his college friends for a night in the town, Jorge was drawn into the Basilica of San Jose de Flores and stood transfixed before the crucifixion. Suddenly, he experienced a life-changing experience before the altar of the Basilica. This numinous experience is strangely similar to the conversion experience of St. Francis before the crucifixion in a country chapel in San Damiano, just outside of Assisi. It was this conversion experience that solidified his resolve to a religious life. Soon after, Jorge joined the Immaculate Conception Seminary in Villa Devoto, Buenos Aires. Upon graduation from the seminary, Bergoglio studied philosophy in Santiago, Chile. And in 1960, he officially became a Jesuit. In that same year, he attended the Colegio de San Jose in San Miguel, graduating with a degree in philosophy. In the following year, he was given a post as teacher of literature and psychology at the Immaculate Conception College in Santa Fe until 1966, when he moved to Colegio del Salvador in Buenos Aires, where he taught the same subjects. In 1969, Bergoglio was ordained as a priest. In that same year, he taught as professor of theology. From 1970 to 71, Father Bergoglio completed his final stage of spiritual formation as a Jesuit at the University of Alcalá de Henares, Spain. And in 1973, he was made the provincial superior of the Society of Jesus, serving at this position for the next 6 years. In 1980, Bergoglio was named rector of the Philosophical and Theological faculty of San Miguel, which he continued until 1986. And in March of 1986, at the age of 50, he moved to Germany to finish his doctoral dissertation at the St. Georgian Graduate School of Philosophy and Theology in Frankfurt. Thereafter, he returned to Argentina to serve as a spiritual director at the Colegio del Salvador, and in 1992, Bergoglio was ordained Bishop of Alca by Cardinal Quaranchino. 5 years later, Bergoglio was appointed to the position of Archbishop of Buenos Aires. As Archbishop, he strengthened the presence of the Church in impoverished areas by constructing new parishes and spearheading the construction of old ones in poverty-stricken neighborhoods, doubling the number of priests working in these areas. In 1998, while serving as Archbishop, Bergoglio was named Ordinary, an office of the Church by reason of office has ordinary powers to execute laws for Eastern Catholics in Argentina who lacked a prelate of their own. It was during this time, as Archbishop, they established the custom to celebrate Holy Thursday through the ritual of washing of the feet in a jail, a hospital, a home for the elderly, or with the poor. The legacy he left as Archbishop was for high-ranking ecclesial officials to display an attitude of poverty and humility. For example, he replaced the extravagant robes of the Archbishop position for the humble robes of a simple priest, used public transportation instead of chauffeurs, lived in a small flat with an older priest, and made his own meals, despite having access to the Archbishop's quarters and a chef. This return to humility continued through his ecclesial career, mirroring the life of Il Poverello, St. Francis of Assisi. That's a little on his early life.
When he was finally selected to be a cardinal, he was actually a bit controversial, because as the Jesuit provincial, and as a bishop, he had to stand between the progressives that he was very positive toward, but also the church as a whole, which was very institutional and held back some of the progressive theologians, and he had a lot of progressive theologians in his own order, the Jesuits. But when he was selected on advice of one of his colleagues who advised Pope John Paul II to select him, John Paul II saw in him somebody who had John Paul II's concern for order, and Cardinal Bergoglio said, sometimes I was too tough. But then he said, but then I converted by listening. And so he had this, not only a care for order, which appealed to Pope John Paul II, but he also had this capacity of learning by constantly being with the people, by constantly being with the poor, by constantly being open to the concerns of those who were most oppressed, especially during what was called in Argentina the Dirty War. And that was because of businesses who were concerned about the socializing of the enterprises started to kill whoever was opposed to them. And that, of course, included a lot of university people, cooperative people, teachers, students. And Bergoglio, as Joe said, who was very much part of the Caranismo movement, with care and concern for the poor, felt torn. He had to stand for the institution, and yet he felt that he had to stand for the poor. So one of the things that he did while he was rector of the seminary was provide sanctuary, secretly of course, for young people who were young men who were targets of the secret police. So that has always been a characteristic of his, the ability to sort of be as a fish to swim through these different currents in the church and in society. And then when in 2000, well, let me stop. Before 2013, he could have been Pope in 2005. Most people don't know that. I didn't know that until I read really what is considered to be the best biography, wherever that is. Oh, it's on yeah, there it is. Thanks, John. Yeah. I've read a lot of these books, and I would definitely affirm my colleague, Dr. Warren Harrington, who was my colleague for 25 years, his judgment that this is the best book. It's called The Great Reformer, Francis and the Making of a Radical Pope by Austin Ivory. But what information is in here is that in 2005, he was already well known among many of the cardinals. And they had a party, as it were, who wanted to select him. And whether it was because he thought that it was Joseph Ratzinger's term, they said that he had that sense of things that are in proper order, or whether it was something else, we don't know. All we know is that he went to his supporters, who were pushing him over the top in that conclave in 2005, and said, no, don't. And so he's sort of knowing that when he was about in his late 60s at the time, and usually a pope lasts for another like 20 years, knowing that he wouldn't be pope if he didn't grab for that moment at that time. And he just felt that he couldn't and shouldn't, and he didn't. And then, of course, you know how God works. God inspired Pope Benedict to be the first pope in 600 years to resign before he died. And so all of a sudden there the opportunity came again. And his party was still there, and they pushed him into being pope. As Joe had mentioned, what was surprising as bishop, priest, archbishop, cardinal, his lifestyle of simplicity and humility and personalism was carried on into the papacy. And there were a number of significant, symbolic things that happened. Some were simple, like he refused to wear the red shoes. The red shoes were kind of like regal shoes, had been brought back by Benedict after John Paul II didn't want to wear them. He brought them back, and Pope Francis said he didn't want those shoes. And all the other simplicity that Joe had mentioned was still there. But what seemed to impress people more than anything is the great sincerity of when he was selected. And first thing he said was, after he came out, was that who he was and what his name was, and that he was the Pope, he said, let's pray for Pope Benedict together. And they said, the Our Father and the glory be. But then he said, I want you to pray for me. Bless me. Because it is your prayers, you are the church, it's your prayers that matter more than my blessing of you, which I, of course, will give. And that humility has carried on. But it has never overwhelmed his sense of responsibility which some people would interpret as power. He feels that if he has a responsibility to keep an order in the church, he will. But he will do it only in a context of collegiality, which had been dropped in the 80s in the church. It was affirmed by Vatican II. All the bishop conferences were told to think about things, to help to contribute to the positions of the Vatican. And from the 80s on, that was all dropped. He came back with collegiality and said, I want to hear from everybody all the time. But I still reserve the right to make this final decision. So it wasn't like he was moving from a democratic position, but he was saying that I am responsible, but I have to make the decisions that are based on listening adequately to everybody, even those who I wouldn't agree with. One thing that I think can help people understand this Pope is that he uses what we would call the Mediterranean approach to law. Mostly we've had what would be called the northern approach to law. The two approaches are this. The northern approach to law is that the law is the minimum that is required. The Mediterranean approach to law is the law is an ideal. So as long as you give adequate attention and respect to the lawgiver, you can then take on responsibility of deciding for yourself. And that happens to be the exercise of a virtue that is probably the least taught virtue. But it came right from Thomas Aquinas. It's the virtue of equity, or the virtue of epikeia. It says to have such a grasp of the spirit of the law that you then know how and when to change it or not to keep it. And that, of course, really is reflecting Jesus, isn't it? I mean, remember, when Jesus broke the most significant law that he had, which is the law of the Sabbath, he said, but the Sabbath is made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And so this pastoral solution, the idea that you can decide when necessary, has created negativity. Because when he has used this pastoral solution in regard to married couples who remarried and did without an annulment and still wanted to go back to the church, he was using the pastoral solution, which has always been in the church. It's always been there. It just hasn't been popularized. It hasn't been publicized, like epikeia hasn't been publicized. He brought it up. And it was that since the law was made for people, not people for the law, there can be a decision made between the couples and the clergyman that this is not a sinful situation as long as it doesn't scandalize the church. So he was very big on that. And of course, as Joe mentioned, he washed the feet of women. I don't know how many people know that that's against the liturgical norms. Some people, as I can see somebody saying, yeah, no, that's against the liturgical norms. But again, it's the same thing of, if that would seem to devalue people who should be valued, then you have to go beside that law or go other side. Also, mercy for gays is something that he's had a lot of gay friends, and he said, it doesn't change my understanding of what is inherent order or disorder, but when people find themselves in a situation that they have not selected for themselves, I would rather err on the side of mercy, he would say. The curial reform, that caused a lot of problems in the Vatican because it had not been changed for hundreds of years. And the Vatican curial officials were not even accountable to the Pope. And so he has really worked on that very strongly. He also has appointed what is called pastoral bishops. Again, going to what I said in the beginning, he took the trend away from the pastoral, away from the center, away from compassion, away from Jesus, toward making law and ritual and orthodoxy absolute, he took that back and he said, I want the kind of people who understand that. Because almost all the bishops that were appointed in the previous 34 years were people who had prioritized law and orthodoxy and ritual. And part of that, of them doing that, is that you may or may not have heard of the Reform of the Reform. There was a pretty strong movement to reform Vatican II. In other words, especially the collegiality, especially the participation of the laity, especially the call of all to the fullness of Christian life, the trying to do away with clericalism. There was a whole movement to go back away from that, and he came out and said there will be no reform of the reform. The liturgy, for example, is meant to be understood and people to contribute, and you can't do that in a foreign language, and Latin's a foreign language, so he has basically put the kibosh on that. He has been addressing injustices in the church and the world, which you know, and he also revoked the investigation of the religion of American women. He recognized Archbishop Romero, the martyr of El Salvador, who was blocked from canonization by the conservatives conservative bishops in El Salvador. And he picked as the first cardinal of El Salvador, Archbishop Romero's assistant, who wasn't even a cardinal. Almost the first non-cardinal selected. But so he's really trying to affirm the primary values of care and concern for the poor over the ritual, orthodoxy, and law. And as an example of that last part, was it last night or 2 nights ago? Last night we had Ovidio here, Father Ovidio, a question that's been coming to a lot of people in light of the lower numbers of clergy in the Western Rite is, why can't there be any? Well, for the first time, we have had a married priest as a pastor 5 minutes from here. And for the first time last night, or the night before, I can't remember. No, it was actually Tuesday, 2 nights ago. We got him to come to speak here. And so I'm hoping that that is the beginnings of people's consciousness so that they are open up to what the Pope has said. In the very beginning, he said, celibacy is a discipline. It's not dogma, it's not doctrine. I'll change it, but I have to be asked. And again, I'm not going to dictate. But if the regional bishops from a region want to ordain married men, ask me and I'll give the permission. It only happened last year that finally one region of bishops, Brazil, asked him, and he said, yes, they have to be what is called viri probata, which viri means men, of course, probati means approved or proven or upright. So I think that we're seeing a movement based on focus on pastoral concerns, focus on people, focus on mercy, focus on collegiality. Okay. Probably give me more time than I should have to that. So now I'm going to go on to his major document, and I'll probably have to try to shorten this up a little bit. I'm trying to select some key statements. This is a relatively long document. And I tried to cut a few of these things away here so that you would understand that it is the key document that he wrote. And what do I mean by key? His first encyclical was a co-encyclical with Pope Benedict. Pope Benedict wrote it, he co-sponsored it. But this is the document that he wanted as the base for his papacy. So if any of his materials that you read including Laudato Si, have to be underpinned by this document. And he tried to focus on, again, joy, the joy of the gospel. But he was saying this is joy found by doing the work that the gospel wants you to do, which is to work for the poor, the blind, the oppressed, the imprisoned, those suffering injustice. And that can't be done cleanly. You can't have a church that is clean, a church that is stepped back, a church that's pristine. If you're working with the poor, the blind, the oppressed, the imprisoned, those suffering injustice, you're going to end up being bruised and hurting and dirty. And he says, that's the kind of church I want, because it means that's the kind of church. That is Jesus, the body of the Christ. And that's what he did, and that's what we should continue to do. And so that means that we have to be willing to get outside of our buildings. Instead of thinking that to be a good Catholic or a good Christian means to go to church, to go to the worship space, we should see that going to the worship space is meant to project us out into the world. And if it doesn't project us out into the world, then it's illegitimate. So he said the missionary options should be renewal of structures demanded by pastoral conversion. If that means you have to change the way you budget, that means you have to change the way you use your facilities. The American bishops said in 1986 in their document on economics that we have a lot of empty buildings now with our church, with our schools closing and maybe less convents. Use them for the poor. Guess what we haven't been doing? And I've had personal experience of that. I had a brother who was a priest here in Canton, and he had a nice house that was being used for youth down in the city, and they said, we don't need this. The youth aren't using this anymore. So what use if we have for it, because we'll just have to keep paying the light and the heat. So they tore it down. And John here is in a parish that had a school, still well-structured school, but the school was closed because they didn't have enough students. So what did they do, since they couldn't use it for the school? Just tore it down. In other words, if you're going to focus on the poor rather than yourself, there's going to have to be structures, renewal of structures. Take chances, being dirty, being bruised, being hurt. And that's what he did when he was in Buenos Aires, and that's what he's asked us to do. And he says that will lead to joy. You say, wait a minute. But that's what the Beatitudes say. The Beatitudes mean, when Jesus, blessed are means happy. Happy are those. Happy are those who are working on behalf of the poor, hunger and thirsting for justice, working for peace, even if it means they're being persecuted, because you will be authentically fulfilled, because you're acting like Jesus. And so finally he then says, in 24 John, you can change that. When Jesus washed the feet of his disciples, he said, you will be blessed if you do this. You will be happy if you do this. And that's why I find that this picture that you all have is so essential. The reason I like this picture is because he is doing what Jesus did. And what have we done to Jesus? We've taken Jesus, we put him on a throne, we put a crown on his head, and called him Christ the King. We've done something to him that he wouldn't let his disciples do to him. And so when John's gospel said, this is what he said. And so when you talk about a servant, you have to remember the word servant means slave. It means somebody whose agenda is set by somebody else. So that's why he says that the church should go to the poor, the sick, those who are usually despised and overlooked. Why? Because that's his mission. Okay? That's the mission. But if the work of the Christ is to care for those people, how can the church, which is the body of the Christ, do it without understanding the way its world is put together, judging the world in the light of the gospel, and then suggesting and acting on changes? So basically then, To understand the good news, you have to understand the bad situation of which we must repent. And so in these last points I'm going to make, which I think are probably problematic for a lot of people, he says the basic source of evil in our world is the system that we have taken for granted. It's a system that basically works according to the laws of competition and survival of the fittest, where the powerful feed upon the powerless. And he says we have to say, thou shalt not, to an economy of exclusion, inequality, because such an economy kills. And of course, he's referring not killing by commission, but by killing by omission, because it's structured so that it omits to give people the things necessary for a truly human life. And so what happens then is that although we name Jesus as God, and we claim that in God we trust and one nation under God, but when we look at the way we live our lives and where our ultimate and most important values are, we realize that we've created new idols. The idolatry of money and the dictatorship of an impersonal economy lacking a human purpose. And then we have to understand this, that the goods we hold when we don't need them are not ours. We are stealing them because God intended the earth and all that it contains for the use of every human being. And therefore, we shouldn't regard our lawful possessions not as our own, but as common property. And that there must be made available to everyone everything necessary for a truly human life, and must consider every neighbor without exception as another self, because God, who has fatherly concern for everyone, has willed that all people should constitute one family, and therefore he's trying to say and struggle for us to understand that the Christian conception of the world is that we are to be a community, a family, not a competing crowd. You can't equate and have any compatibility between a family and a competitive means of distributing resources, because families wouldn't do that. Okay. And then, of course, you're going to get uprisings, because those excluded from the system are going to rebel. And this system is not just not running well, it's not corrupted, it's not broken. It is designed to create conditions that are incompatible with Christianity. It's unjust and perverse. And therefore, whatever stands in the way of prophets, whatever is fragile, like the environment, is defenseless.
In keeping with the themes that shaped him during his early years and throughout his life, compassion for the exploited, awareness of the root causes of exploitation, action directed toward eliminating the root causes of exploitation, a deep sense of social justice, a vision of the unity of spirit and nature, regard for the cultural and racial diversity and cooperative energy. In his encyclical, Laudato Si, on care of our common home, Pope Francis transposes these themes into a new ecological key. In Laudato Si, his compassion for the exploited becomes compassion for the exploited earth and creatures of the earth. His awareness of the root causes of human exploitation become a knowledge of the systemic causes of human exploitation of the earth and earthly creatures. His sense of social justice becomes ecological justice. His social activism becomes a deep ecological activism. His perception of the unity of spirit and nature becomes a vision of the transcendent immanence of divinity. And his appreciation of the value of cultural and national diversity becomes an appreciation of the inherent value of preserving the diversity of all living creatures. This transposition distinguishes Pope Francis as the first ecological pontiff. That Pope Francis is the first ecological pontiff is also reflected in his pontifical name, as Joe pointed out. Among the 265 popes who preceded him, Pope Francis is the only pope to name himself after the most famous of Catholic saints, the Virgin Mary, the saint who has been called the most Christ-like of all saints, St. Francis of Assisi. This choice is significant, for among all the Catholic saints, St. Francis has become known, and for good reason, as the patron saint of ecology, given his profound metaphysical conception and his deep love of creation and creatures. The first thing that one notices upon reading Pope Francis's encyclical is the main title, Laudato Si. Perhaps you can take a look at, I did a translation of my own of the Canticle of the Creatures by St. Francis. It's his most famous poetical writing. If you look to the second stanza, you see it begins, Laudato Si. And so Pope Francis uses this Laudato Si as the title of his book, his encyclical. So what do these strange words mean? And where do they originate? As is well known to those familiar with the writings of St. Francis, the locution Laudato Si is the first line of the second verse of St. Francis's famous Canticle of the Creatures, written during his final days in 1225 in the Umbrian dialect of his native Italy. In English it says, "Praise be you," laudato, and then the Si is you. Of course, the you refers to our Lord. But what is implicit in this title is the remainder of the sentence. The remainder of the sentence reads, as you can see, "Mi Signor con tutte le tue creature." My Lord, with all your creatures. The full meaning of the locution, Laudato Si, becomes intelligible, therefore, only when it's connected to the remainder of the line. Pope Francis certainly fashioned this title deliberately, as an invitation to the reader to give thought to how praising the Lord involves also, and at the same time, praising creatures. This statement needs some clarification. In the vast sea of secondary literature on the Canticle, there has been much debate about the Italian preposition kun. It's kun in the Umbrian dialect, con in the Tuscan official language of Italy. Does kun, with, mean two things that are separate but next to one another, as a father is literally with his children? Or does it mean with or together in the sense that two things may be identified as separate by name alone, but in fact belong to one another, as parts of the body are, for instance, as a hand is one with an arm, or an arm is one with a shoulder? The hand makes no sense. I mean, it's bizarre, right? A hand without the arm. So what does the word with mean here? It seems like a little thing, but everything hinges on that. If one chooses the first sense of the word with, as St. Francis's intention, one must also assume that the Lord is purely transcendent, a demiurge who created the world but has left his creation and is not in creation any longer. But on this assumption, one must also contend that the Lord is not omnipresent, which is inconsistent with his divinity. Conversely, if one assumes that the with means that there's no part of divinity that is not in creation, then one embraces a pantheistic metaphysics, which necessarily implies that the Lord is finite, since nature is finite, which is also inconsistent with the nature of divinity. Both amount to bad metaphysics. The best answer, the one consistent with St. Francis's view of creation, and the one Pope Francis embraces, is that the Lord is both immanent and transcendent. He is in creation and at the same time infinitely transcends nature. As such, we must conclude that the word kun in the phrase kun tutte le tue creature, which haunts and completes the line Laudato Si, it meant for St. Francis and for Pope Francis as well, with in the sense of identity, as a ray of light is with the sun, is in fact the sun. One of the great mysteries of creation that Pope Francis discusses in his encyclical is that all creatures are with the Lord, and in a fourfold sense. First, The Lord is with his creatures insofar as all creatures are ceaselessly arising out of the Creator. Imagine like sparks coming from a big fire with wet wood, and all things are pouring forth from divinity. Secondly, he is with his creatures insofar as he is not separate from creation. As we say to each other, let's talk one-to-one, which means nothing in between, something intimate. Third, he is with his creatures insofar as all creatures are in him. If God is the encompassing, everything has to be inside of him, right? There's nothing outside of the encompassing. And the last one is the deep mystery and hard to grasp by humans. What is that? He is with all his creatures insofar as he is in all creatures. The totality of God is in the smallest of creatures. So it's in this fourfold sense that we should understand the word kun, with, in the remainder of the omitted line taken by Pope Francis from St. Francis's Canticle of Creatures as the main title of his encyclical. That's the only metaphysics I'm going to talk about. I'll get back down to earth here. That Pope Francis is the first ecological pontiff is also supported by the subtitle of the encyclical. The subtitle reads, On Care of Our Common Home. Why did Pope Francis give his encyclical this subtitle? He did this for three reasons. First, the word oikoi in ancient Greek means home, and it's the root of our word ecology. What the pontiff is underscoring in his subtitle is that the earth is our home, the home of the human race. But not only this, he's also saying, let us not be so blinded by humanism so as to forget that the earth is the home not only to humans, but of all creatures. The earth is our common home, the subtitle reads, where the word common means all creatures, human and non-human alike. Finally, by adding the word care, he's echoing the exhortation of the Old Testament for humans to become stewards or caretakers of the earth and earthly creatures. He's saying, therefore, in his subtitle, as it is the obligation for parents and to all family members to do their part in caring for their family and home, in like manner, it is the responsibility of human beings to take care of the common home of all creatures. Creatures, we may add, who St. Francis often referred to in his poetry, in his prayers, and even in his everyday life as his mother, brothers, and sisters. Given the richness and depth of Pope Francis's magnificent interdisciplinary ecological masterpiece, Laudato Si', only a book-length commentary would succeed in bringing to light its full significance. Here, I can only give you a thumbnail sketch of its main topics. In his introduction, Pope Francis begins his encyclical with a comment on the first words of the second verse of St. Francis's Canticle of the Creatures. By doing so, he not only sheds light on the title of the encyclical, with particular reference to St. Francis's practice of referring to creatures and creation in familial metaphors, as he reminds us of the ontological status and vital importance of the natural environment. Following in the footsteps of St. Francis, he reminds us of our profound intimacy with the earth, similar to the intimacy uniting siblings to their mother and father and to one another. As children sharing the same mother and father, who also share the combined DNA of their parents, he reminds us, in like manner, all creatures are composed of the same elements that compose our earthly mother and heavenly father. They are all spiritualized, as the father, energy, as the mother. And the mother and father are always together. In the second paragraph of his introduction, by sharp contrast, he announces a new kind of sin that has become endemic in modern times, the great sin against the earth. He opens our ears to the cries of our Mother Earth, due to the wounds we have inflicted upon her because of, quote, our irresponsible use and abuse of the goods which God has endowed her. He then identifies a twofold root cause of this sin in humanity's false view of themselves as lords and masters over nature, feeling entitled to plunder her at will due to an economic system that places profit above well-being. This violent, competitive, anthropocentric relationship with creation, predominant in our world today, he points out, is the root cause of environmental devastation. Among the poor, he continues, the earth herself and the creatures of the earth are among the most abandoned and maltreated of the poor. Quoting Romans 8:22. He says that our mother earth groans in travail. Our sin against the earth involves also an oversight of our own material existence. We are literally dust of the earth, stardust, as stated in Genesis. Our bodies are in fact stardust. Our breath is her air. Our life is her waters. In the final paragraph of the introduction, Pope Francis informs us of some principal themes that he'll reframe again and again throughout the work. As examples, he lists the following: the intimate relationship between the poor and the fragility of our planet, the conviction that everything in the world is interconnected, the critique of new forms of power derived from technology, the call to seek new ways of understanding the economy and progress, the inherent value of each creature. That's a radical point. There's a big debate in environmental studies about whether or not creation or creatures have inherent value or instrumental value. And the environmentalists who believe in the instrumental value believe that we should take care of the environment, because if we don't, we're going to destroy ourselves. So it's in our own interest. But there's a deeper kind of ecology, it came to be called deep ecology, which claims that nature has inherent value, even if there are no humans on the earth. If you go to Genesis, actually, before humans ever were created, God keeps saying it was good. So there's no humans there. So God is saying it's good. So once I came up with 7 arguments for the inherent value of nature. But the Pope says deliberately, explicitly in the encyclical, that he believes that he's an ecocentric, not an anthropocentric position. In the the call to seek new ways of understanding the economy and progress, the inherent value of each creature, the human meaning of ecology, the need for forthright and honest debate, the responsibility of local and international policy, the critique of our throwaway culture, and the need for a new lifestyle. Laudato Si unfolds in 6 chapters. Chapter 1 answers the question, what is happening to our common home? Here we find Pope Francis the scientist, and he's using the consensus of the scientific researcher of the day to describe the environment. It covers issues such as pollution, climate change, water, the loss of biodiversity, the resulting decline in the quality of human life, and the breakdown of society, global inequality, and he offers strong scientific counter-arguments to weak political and economic opinions about our current environmental crisis. Chapter 2 sets forth a clear exposition of Pope Francis's eco-theology, the view of creation from the standpoint of biblical accounts. In this chapter, he treats topics such as the light offered by faith, the eco-wisdom of biblical accounts, the mystery of the universe, the message of each creature within the harmony of creation, universal communion, and the common destination of goods. Chapter 3 explores the human roots of our ecological crisis. In this chapter, Pope Francis identifies the root cause of ecological devastation, treating topics such as technology, the globalization of technology, and the effects of modern anthropocentric and competitive economics. Chapter 4 is an exposition of his notion of what he calls integral ecology. In this chapter, he points out the intersecting points of environmental philosophy and economic and social ecology, and he underscores and clarifies the important principle of common goods. The chapter concludes with an extension of moral considerability to future generations. Chapter 5 outlines the practical side of ecological activism. He calls it an ecological practical wisdom, an ecological phronesis, to echo the ancient Greek notion of practical wisdom. In this chapter, he treats topics such as the need for dialogue about the environment with the international community, dialogue concerning national and local environmental policies, the decision-making process in determining environmental policies, which I told you he calls an ecological phronesis, an ecological practical wisdom. the need for and to consider human fulfillment and not only economic and political considerations in determining environmental policies, and the need for religion to be in dialogue with science. The final chapter contains Pope Francis's theory of ecological education and ecological spirituality. In this chapter, he treats topics such as lifestyle changes, education for the covenant between humanity and the environment, ecological conversion, joy and peace in relation to the natural world, civic and political love, sacramental signs and the celebration of rest, the Trinity and the relationship among creatures, the Virgin Mary in creation, and the infinite beauty of the immanence of our Lord. And then the work concludes with two prayers that he wrote, a prayer for the earth and a Christian prayer in union with creation. And I find the book quite useful as a teaching tool also, because at the end there's another appendix that offers discussion questions for each chapter. So whether you're a teacher or not, you can ponder those questions. I find it to be a magnificent work, and I've been doing work in environmental philosophy for years. It's a masterpiece, and it's not naive scientifically either. I was quite impressed with the science. Okay, that's all I got.
Okay, we're not too far beyond what where we're supposed to be. I'll just make a few comments, and then hopefully you'll have some questions. There have been some controversies, of course, with the Pope. I mentioned the one about his using the pastoral solution in regard to the remarrying, going to the sacraments, but it's only a controversy because he made it public. It was always available to pastors. Women's ordination is an issue which he said is closed because Pope John Paul II said it was. The only thing about that is that's a little bit inconsistent with his saying that ultimately all decisions in the church have to go back to Jesus, and so to go back only to this last pope to say that it's over is a bit of an inconsistency, and we will have to see whether or not that changes at all in the future. The clerical sexual abuse is an issue that is reared its ugly head with the fact that he tried to address it. He had a council to deal with it, a commission, and it basically stopped, although it's now being reestablished. And also has been saying that they've said that he's allowing a bishop who was involved in committing sexual abuse to be a bishop, and this is in Chile. He's starting to look at that. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you, John. He's starting to look at his decision. He was concerned by this about this person being, this bishop being accused without enough evidence, but now he's decided to send his best investigator down there to look at that. So again, what we find is he's always open to change. He may take a strong position, and then if he finds being open to people's comments that maybe he should change, he's tries to do that. We find that in the United States, he has appointed a number of bishops who are much more pastoral. And the future, if he can do 5 more years of bishop appointments, he will probably change the character of the American bishoprics, and that may happen. So we have sort of given you a whole lot of stuff, and as you can see, we could extend that into a course without too much difficulty. It only gives you just a basic overview, probably not as detailed in many areas as you would like. So what we'd like to do is spend the last 20 minutes asking you to comment or ask further questions of us, and then we can still get out at the amount of time that we were assigned. Okay? Anybody have any questions or comments? It doesn't have to be a question. Yes? Is there a question there? No.
Yeah, I got it.
Yeah.
The Western rite of married men,
Yes.
does that include all the priests in America?
Okay, what I was referring to is the fact that if the bishops want to ask the Pope for permission to ordain married men in all of the United States, they can do that. The rule would still stay that a man cannot become a priest and then be married, because in the Eastern rite, they have to be married before they are ordained. Okay, so that is, but again, it's not unlike the women's ordination issue, it's not a theological issue, it's just a discipline issue, and it could change. And according to Father Video Marginian, he said, well, it'll change if the people ask for it, but the people don't know it's an option, so they haven't asked for it. So I would say the first step is publicity. Just telling people what the Pope said, and that this is possible. And then, because of the concerns, 5 years ago, we had to merge, 30 parishes in the diocese, and another 5 years, maybe another 30, which wouldn't have to happen if you had enough clergy. I know my nephew, Father Sean Conboy, was in charge of 3-4 parishes that had 1,400 families into one parish. Well, there's no reason it could have been 3 or 4 parishes if we had had enough men to be the pastors. Yes, please.
Okay, the little black book.
Nice and loud, or you can use this.
The little black book that we use for Lenten meditations, and just recently, I was the last couple of days, there was he was a calligrapher. Anyway, he was a priest. He was ordained a priest, left the priesthood, became married, wife died, went back to the priesthood. That was up in Oregon. Is that very common?
I literally don't know. John would probably know the answer to that. Is that common, John?
Common, that's a good question. It happens. You know, that's all.
Okay.
I don't know how many 50 people it is.
Maybe 50, he said.
What about the priests that have left the priesthood or are still married? Is there a possibility of bringing it back?
Not as long as they're married. And one of the difficulties is even if the marriage is annulled, then the problem is what they call scandal, or they would have to leave the area, and they might not want to do that. But would this Pope, if that was brought to him, would he act differently? There seems to be evidence that he would, but that's not the thing he would want. He wants everything basically done at the local level as much as possible. Yeah. Yes, please.
You spoke about the reintroduction of collegiality. Explain that again to me.
Yes.
What that means.
Yeah. What collegiality means, if you remember from Vatican II, is that, well, it's the application of the basic moral principle regarding authority to the church. The basic principle that the church has regarding authority is subsidiarity. Now, who here, I can't go through a whole time without asking questions, but who here knows what subsidiarity means? One of my students is laughing because he just wanted me to call him. John put his hand up. Good. Tell us.
My understanding is subsidiarity has to do with not doing from above what can be done from below, not taking away the power and the ability of those people or those individuals and institutions below our particular level.
Yes, and that is standard church moral thought regarding authority. We oftentimes we will disobey our own laws. And we tend to want to take all the power ourselves instead of trusting that those lower than us can do it themselves. The principle also says that the higher level still has a role to direct and to urge and to maybe constrain if necessary, but they should let it happen first. And it did among the region of orders of bishops until the 80s. And then Rome said, we don't want you making any major rules without passing them through us. And this Pope has come back and said, no, we got to go back to Vatican II because it's good policy and gives the respect to the local churches that they should have, that they can handle their own issues without having to go up higher. Does that help? Yeah. Yes?
I can't remember it exactly, but John the 23rd had a practice of, if he was going to discipline, to do it gently or something. It reminded me of how Pope Francis did. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I think so.
Tell us what it is.
Oh, I'm not sure exactly what word it is, but I think what he's basically saying is that when you have to discipline somebody, you have to understand that the person is more important than the act which they did. See, too often we tend to dismiss the person because we have to condemn the act. So the idea of condemning the sin but loving the sinner is very difficult to do. And I am more inclined to say that I would rather be, as Jesus says we should be, like the father of the prodigal son. And you remember that story. The son was going to come back to his father and say, I'm sorry. He never had to, because his father had already forgiven him. All he had, as God already forgives us, all you have to do is accept the forgiveness that's already there. So, and the understanding that's infinite. God understands our weaknesses so much more than even we do. So I think that the Pope would say, make a distinction between the evil, which is an evil, but the person who has infinite value and always act in mercy.
Okay, let's look at the other side.
Yes.
He was the righteous one, and he was the one that ended up being unrighteous by not going in for the party.
Oh, yeah, you're talking about the older son.
Yes.
Yes, oh yes, yeah. Right, he didn't understand his father. We don't understand God. We don't want God to be merciful. Yeah. Yes, please.
I don't want to change the subject,
But you're going to.
but I'm going to. I spent most of my life in the electric utility industry, so we generated a lot of pollution when I first started. In fact, pollution was everywhere. And I can remember going to Barberton, Ohio one time, getting my car to change the oil, and they just opened the plug and let it drain into the creek, that was running under the... And when I was in the power plant, I mean, we used to turn on the fans and blow all the ash over to West Virginia. But the first meeting I went to in the Environmental Protection Agency Act was passed. There was so much smoke in there. I mean, you couldn't even breathe. With all the cigars and everything else. So we've made a lot of progress, and I would like to think that the Pope has seen that we've generated a tremendous amount of reduction in a lot of the things that he's talking about. In fact, there used to be a joke that we told when we have our pollution meetings that if Moses were to split the Red Sea today, God says, okay, I'll split the Red Sea if you write the environmental protection statement. But anyway, I think we should kind of acknowledge the fact that we put a lot of time and effort into trying to clean things up. Maybe we have a long way to go. We don't know where the limits are and this stuff. But it seemed like that was missing. Like as if we're still polluting everything else and killing people and whatnot, and we're trying not to.
Mine is according to the marriage. A person that's married can still receive the sacrament or Eucharist. Is that?
what I was trying to explain, and I had it up there on the, it's a standard policy, it's been a standard policy, which has been called the pastoral solution. The pastoral solution means that even though you cannot publicly show that this marriage is sort of legitimate because it wasn't annulled, if the individuals are convinced that it is, and the pastor is convinced with them, he can give them permission as long as they receive the sacraments in a way that doesn't cause scandal, and that usually means not in their home parish. That's always been the case, but no one's known about it, just like they haven't known about the virtue of equity or epikeia, as I was mentioning. The very fact that the Pope made it so public, that created some reaction on the part of certain people, not the majority, but certain ones. Any other final comments here? We've still got 5-6 minutes. Please, John.
Given the trajectory of this Pope,
Yes.
he should live, please God, another 10 years and be active and be in power. What do you see, what would you predict would be some changes beyond today that we might see?
Well, the ones that are already happening, for example, he has tried to reform the Vatican Bank. And there's a lot of resistance to that, but he's been doing that. He's been trying to change the attitudes that we have toward women. On the one hand, he's been very clear about that, like he withdrew the investigation of the American sisters. And that was very, very significant. That's balanced off on the other side. He said, okay, but the change, and women should have much, much more responsibility, but it can't go all the way to priesthood. It's balanced off. Do I think that maybe something could change in that area? I think, as I explained, since he has said the central reality is Jesus, and what Jesus wants, to give his reason is that we won't talk about this because the Pope John Paul II didn't want to talk about it. That struck me as a bit contradictory, and whether there will be a change made in that area, I don't know. But since women do not feel, the sisters do not feel as attacked, I think they might be more inclined to be more cooperative. He is going to more collegiality. He's focusing more on openness around the world in terms of immigration. I don't see many more things that'll come up that'll be new. I think what he's been doing, trying to expand ministry and emphasize the social mission of the church, I think that will just continue. But the greatest resistance to Pope John Paul II from among the bishops, regional groups of bishops, is the United States.
Very good. John Paul II or Pope Francis?
Pope Francis. I'm sorry. Did I say John Paul II? Sorry. No. The greatest resistance, yes, to Pope Francis and all of these changes that he's making has come from the United States. But that's because almost all of our bishops that we have now were selected by the 2 previous popes. And as he has selected bishops that are more pastoral, things have started to change. But he needs at least 5 more years, probably, of pastoral appointments. But I see it continuing to happen. Not because of Francis, and this may surprise you. I'm going to lay this out here. Not because of Francis, but Francis represents the change that's already taking place in the church. Francis isn't making the church change. Why do I say that? I say that because in 2005, the cardinals wanted to make Francis Pope. And so when 2013 came along, nobody recognized that he was what they call papabile. He was very able to be Pope. Why? Because he had already submitted his resignation, because he was already 75. They picked him not as some surprise, although it surprised the media and us, but it didn't surprise them. They wanted the kind of change that he represented. They even wanted it before. So if the church has changed, and they have changed, and they want this curial change, they want more collegiality, they want more social concern, and you're getting more of it because this Francis has made more third world cardinals than there ever were before. I think that's just going to continue because I think the church has changed. He represents and it can lead the change, but I don't think he produced it. Yes, please.
We have these envelopes we put in once or twice a year for overseas collection. There's one person made a comment, why do we have to send money overseas when we got our own poor to take care of?
Yeah, I've heard that too. And I think the answer that the Pope would say is, those overseas are your poor. Because when we say our Father, we don't say my Father, or the United States Catholic's Father. It's our Father. And everybody is our brother and sister. There are poor here, we should take care of them. Can we? Of course we can. We don't, but it's not because we're sending money to our other brothers and sisters. It's because we are neglecting the responsibilities here. It's both and. It's not either or. Yes?
How if we put it in perspective, our poor are probably 10 times richer than the poorest in the other countries.
Well, that's also true. That's also true. When I was in El Salvador, I was having an immersion experience there, and if the people could get $5 a day, they were happy. So you're right. Yeah. Okay, any final comments?
Shall we express our appreciation?
Thank you very much.